I want to continue my history of modernist philosophy by moving now from Bergson into Toynbee. Specifically, I want to study Toynbee's great work, A Study of History. Now, I do have some pre-existent YouTube videos on Toynbee where a couple of years ago I read the Somervell translation of Toynbee, which is a 2-volume edition, the one that most people read, that was put out in 1960, and which is a synopsis of the first 10 volumes. Toynbee's Study of History was published between 1934 and 1960 in 12 total volumes. So it was a very long, it was really a lifelong magnum opus. And Somervell, the D.C. Somervell, Somervell came along and shortened the book and abridged it into 2 volumes, which is all that anyone ever reads of Toynbee anymore in 1960. And it's handy because it's available in a nice paperback mass market edition, a little box 2-volume set that I used to have, or you can get the standard hardcover version of it. Most people only read the first of those 2 volumes anyway. Toynbee is very readable, and I think that what I'm going to do for this synopsis is to do, even though I already have a YouTube video that's a distillation of my reading of Somervell, it's only a 2-part, a part 1 YouTube video and a part 2 YouTube video that's only 15 minutes each, and it's just the upshot of Toynbee. What I want to do here now is what I did in my Spangler videos, which is to say to go through Toynbee chapter by chapter, which of course for the 12-volume edition would be an impossibility. So what I want to use to do that is Toynbee's very little known and little read, his own abridgment that he did in 1972, 3 years before his death in 1975. I think he was born in 1889 and died in 1975. And in 1972, he put out this illustrated, oversized edition of A Study of History that he revised himself. So the advantage of this book, it has a number of advantages. One is that it's done by himself rather than somebody else. So he's going through and pulling out the details and the criteria that he wants, that he thinks will be sufficient to illustrate the thesis. Number 2, it's illustrated, and illustrations are always fun. But number 3, it's coming at the end of his career, where now, since he started the book in he says he started making the first notes in the 20s, somewhere between 1920 and 1927. He was already writing out the notes for the first 10 volumes. But so much has happened historically, the Second World War and so forth, the Cold War. He's writing this in the middle of the Cold War. All these things have changed history, and as he says in the foreword to this book, the current events of the present change the events of the past. This is exactly, and he's read Bergson. Bergson has had influence on Toynbee, and this is of course exactly what Bergson says in the beginning of Creative Evolution about la durée, where the present moment, you can never step into the same river of consciousness twice because the present moment is always changing. It's always undergoing transformation, and as it changes, no moment is ever the same as any preceding moment, and therefore no past moment is ever the same either, because we're always filtering the past through the continual changing river of the present. Same thing here with Toynbee. What he begins this book by saying in the foreword is that all these new historical events, plus the new archaeological discoveries, Africa, the pre-Islamic African civilization was much better known by 1972. The Mesopotamian civilization was much better known. So there are new civilizations being unearthed that he includes in his thesis. And as he says in the foreword, the number of civilizations that he originally studied was 21, but in this final synopsis of his work, which is the volume that we're going to read here chapter by chapter, he counts 31 civilizations, in addition to a few more that were abortive. Now, 31 civilizations, even 21, is an awful lot, and I think one of the problems with Toynbee, in contrast to Oswald Spengler, whom he had read and was one of the main things that he's responding to here, just as Jean Gebser read Spengler, and his ever-present origin that he wrote in 1949 was his response to Spengler's identification of the decline of the West. Here, Toynbee has read Spengler initially, in the right around just after World War I. Volume 1 of Decline of the West was published in 1918, and Toynbee read it. He knew that Spengler was onto something, but he didn't like Spengler's pessimism and his determinism, so he rejected the determinist model, and he'll bring in here a British empiricist model that's based on a response to, number 1, to the challenge presented by Spengler, and number 2, a general morphological theory that shows civilizations as responses to challenges given to them by their environment. It may be the physical environment, but it may be also a social environment that the particular civilization in question is responding to. But now the problem, though, with all these civilizations, Spengler only sees 9 civilizations. His model is very concrete and intuitive and makes a lot of good sense. Toynbee goes a little crazy on numbering these civilizations. He sort of synthesizes where he should analyze, and he analyzes and separates them where he should be synthesizing them, these civilizations. So he's got too many of them. For example, he's got originally the Hindu civilization is divided into an an Indic civilization, which begins about 1500 BC and goes down to the time, I think, of Ashoka, and then he's got a Hindu civilization proper, which he sees beginning with Ashoka's unification of Indian civilization and going from there. That's not two different civilizations, though. That's one single civilization. The culture forms are complete. Now, if you want to separate out the Mohenjo-Daro Harappan society from that civilization, I have no trouble with that. Those do strike me as two separate civilizations. The sort of, even though there are lots of cultural continuities, but it's a pre-Aryan civilization. And so Toynbee ends up with three Indian civilizations. Really, there's only that early Mohenjo-Daro, the so-called, what's called nowadays the Harappan civilization, which begins around 2500 BC and goes down to 1500 BC, and then we get the Indo-Aryan invasions. And yes, despite Indian pundits who have insisted to the contrary that the Indo-Aryan invasions never took place, they are absolutely dead wrong. Those invasions did take place, and a new culture comes in on top of the native Dravidian civilization, and from out of that fusion, we do indeed get Indian civilization. That model still holds. That modernist model that Joseph Campbell talked about, that V. Gordon Childe talked about, that was the model, of Henri Frankfurt. That still holds, despite the deconstructive attempts of Indian pundits, mostly motivated, I think, by nationalist tendencies. And nationalism always perverts truth. So you never want to use nationalism to try to create truth, because that's an oxymoron. That invasion took place, and he also, Toynbee also separates out Chinese civilization into two civilizations: a Sinic civilization, then a later Chinese civilization. That makes no sense. And it's also questionable that he separates out the Japanese civilization, which in this book now he regards the Japanese, the Korean, and the Vietnamian civilizations as what he calls satellite civilizations to the Chinese civilization. That's debatable. I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable separating out Japanese society from Chinese society as a separate civilization. They strike me as being very much the same civilization. It's almost as though you would make the argument that Great Britain, because of its geographical isolation from the continent, constitutes its own civilization in opposition to the continental civilization, which is a point that in the first chapter here he specifically refutes. So why refute that and yet uphold the Japanese civilization? And its relationship to the mainland is similar to Great Britain's relationship to the continental mainland, and the culture forms are basically the same. They're localized, of course, but they're basically the same. They're very similar. So there are lots of problems. He's got the the Sumero-Akkadian civilization being separate from the Babylonian civilization. Those should be the same civilization, and so on. I won't bore the listener with the tedium of this, but just suffice it to say that Toynbee has a pretty good eye, or I wouldn't be studying him here, and he supplements Spengler. He's aware of a lot more societies than Spengler is. It's just that we have to take into account what the criteria for his divisions are. Sometimes they're questionable. So moving right into the book now, we move from the foreword to part one, which is called The Shape of History, where he says that he begins his study by searching for a unit of historical study that is relatively self-contained and is therefore more or less intelligible in isolation from the rest of history. Now, the first thing he starts with is to say that, let's take Great Britain. But before he gets to that, that's actually, that was in the original introduction to the Somerville. He puts another introduction in front of that. So let's hold off on that for a second, where he talks about the relativity of historical thought. And he first begins here by talking about how, as a kid, he used to stay every now and then at a professor's house, and he noticed as he grew up over time that the books on the professor's shelves changed over time. In the beginning, there were these large general historical compendia, and then over time, they began to be invaded by these specialized monographs with these grim and severe bindings from all these different authors, or anthologies with all these different authors and no common theme. And he began to be aware over time that the library was much less interesting, because as specialism invaded this professor's library, it sort of turned Toynbee off. It wasn't as much fun anymore. And he starts off here with a critique of specialism by saying that And his point of view here is somewhat similar to Bergson's in Creative Evolution in that both men are responding to the mechanistic approach, the industrial way of doing things. Toynbee is drawing a boundary here of his own between the humanistic approach, or what he regards as the properly humanistic approach, versus the industrial approach. And fragmentation and specialization he sees as an application and intrusion of the industrial worldview into the humanities. He starts off by saying here that there have been two forces that have characterized modernity: industrialization on the one hand and nationalization on the other. And first is his critique here of industrialization, in which he says that too often the problem with historians is that because they are predisposed toward specialization, and specialization is the intrusion of the industrial method of fragmentation into the humanities, they tend to see history in terms of their own nation states. A French historian will try to write a history of the West as a history of France. Same thing with a British historian. You do find this kind of parochialism and provincialism quite a bit in historical studies, seeing one's own nation state as though it were the whole rather than a part of a larger unity is itself a method of fragmentation. And he even invokes Bergson here and says that Bergson's critique of the intellect, which is predisposed to the outer world to break it up into fragments, and Bergson counters that with what he calls intuition, which sees things in terms of holistic unities. And Toynbee says we should take Bergson's caveat in mind here. What Toynbee himself is looking for are larger historical unities than mere nation-state histories. Those won't do when it comes to understanding the dynamics of the historical field and looking for an intelligible field of historical study. Then he moves on to critique nationalism, and he talks about how nationalism is, of course, one of the great distorting tendencies. And nationalism has changed so dramatically over time. He says that prior to the First World War, you had a few what he calls great powers: France, Great Britain, Germany, and these great powers were all had been engaged in centuries of warfare to prevent any one of them from dominating the rest. That's what history in the West has been about. But then by the time you get World War I, the great powers, a couple of them disintegrate. The Austro-Hungarian great power disintegrates. The Ottoman Empire disintegrates. And then we are left with, by the time of the ending of World War II, we're just left with two great powers: the bipolar Cold War system of Russia and America as the bipolar system with two great powers. But then we get this sudden profusion after World War II of over 100, something like 140 nation states start springing up like mushrooms all over the world. And these nation states, Toynbee says, are kind of questionable because none of them could be regarded as a great power. None of them really has, with the possible exception, I suppose, of Israel, a military strong enough to back it up and make it a great power. And also, culturally speaking, many of these nation states are not really representative of proper ethnic or cultural groupings. The whole situation in Yugoslavia that broke out in the 90s is testament to this, I think, where we get the failure of the nation state to contain the cultural entities, the ethnic groupings. They don't map on. There are too many of these nation states, Toynbee says, after World War II, and none of them can really be elevated to great powers. And indeed today, we of course now have only one great power with America, and all of these nation states that are crumbling and breaking apart with all of these tribal warfares, these ethnicities springing up. And now we're in Samuel Huntington's world of the clash of nations, where he says, or the clash of civilizations, where he says that the nation-state model is breaking down, the bipolar model is breaking down, and today's allegiance is ethnic and cultural. Where you're at on the map, and however debatable this thesis is, and it is very debatable, there are lots of problems with Huntington's model, but wherever you're at on the map for Huntington depends on what your ethnicity is. What religion do you have backing you up? He sees the Balkan crisis, for instance, as Croats and Serbs and Bosnians as essentially a conflict between three different civilizations, between Western Christendom, Eastern Christendom, and the Islamic world. So it's a very different society now, and Toynbee is recognizing this already in 1972. So then he moves on into the proper introduction, which the field of historical study, which formed the original introduction in the original series, where he now looks at the possibility of finding an intelligible unit of historical study. And he starts by saying, let's take Great Britain. Is it possible for us to isolate Great Britain as an intelligible unit of historical study? Let's take a look at it. And so as